And now we're going to take a look at collision objects. And we're going to start out just by using some of the default collisions, and then later take a look at how we can use them with different objects. Let's start out just by adding in a particle. We'll use a particle emitter. I'm going to close out this properties panel and open it up directly within the object properties. I'm going to create a group, and we still have group 1 and group 2 left over from before, because even when we clear out our scene, our groups are still kind of left over. So I'm going to select group 1, or if you don't have that, you can create a new group and then type in group 1. I'm going to set our particle limit to 10,000, increase our frame timeline to 300, and also our particles, make sure they're set to 300 as well. And now what I want to do is create a gravity object. And first I'm just going to move up our emitter a little bit higher into the scene and add in that gravity, which we'll just call gravity. Move that to group 1 and take a look at how this is going to affect our scene. And what I just want to do is increase that value to -1.5, just so we have a little bit of stronger gravity, and the rest of the default settings will be fine. So now we want to add in our collision object, and our first collision object. So we're first going to click on the collision button, and now we can name our collision, and I'm going to call this collision_1. And now we have our properties panel, which is shown up. I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. We're going to use the object properties, and I want to make sure I change this to our group 1 so that we're within the group for all of our other dynamics. And if I start to scrub through, we can see that just with the defaults that we have a collision with our current particles. I'm going to go ahead and move this bounce up, making sure that we're at frame 0 so we do not create keyframes. And now we can see them just kind of falling around our object. If we go and take a look at our different options, we can see that we have different types of collision objects. I could change that to a box. And we're just seeing them sort of stick to our box right now because our bounce bind power is set to only 100%. And I can change this to a plane. And we can see that showing up. And also keep in mind that the plane option is going to be infinite. So no matter where the position is on the X and the Z, it's not going to matter too much, just basically on the Y. Unless, of course, it's rotated and we have more of an angle. But basically, this will continue and carry out throughout the scene, and we don't need to worry about setting up a limitation, because in that case, we would want to use a box object. We also have object subdivision, infinite, which is just going to be an infinite collision. We can see that attracting our objects directly. And then object advanced. And that is going to give us a more accurate calculation when we're using an object. And right now, since this is only linked to itself, and it's just a collision object by itself, and it's not directly linked to an object, we can't really take a look at that. But later, once we add in specific objects with polygons that we'd like to use as collision objects, we'll be able to see that. I'm going to switch this back to sphere. And I also want to move this directly underneath our particle emitter. And we can take a look at some of our other options. The first that we see is our radius, which allows us to change the size of our collision. And that's showing up within the OpenGL display, fairly straightforward. Our next option is the bounce bind power, and this is going to have to do with the mode that we have currently set. So let's take a look at our different modes. Right now we have this set to bounce, and it's not really bouncing at this point, And there's a couple of reasons why. It has to do with our roughness and also our bounce bind power, which we'll get into once we cover the different modes. We also have stick, and that's going to cause our particles to stick to the collision object and then remain connected to that object. And we can see that showing up as I scrub through, and they're just starting to sort of gather on the bottom because of our gravity that we have pulling them down, but of course it's still going to stick to the object. Erase is another option that we have, and this will erase our particles from the scene. And this is a really important collision object, and we'll be using this a little bit later once we start working on the different groups. It also has to do with our new group option that we'll see on the bottom. So we can erase our particles as we hit this collision object, which will also end the particle, and that's going to be very important a little bit later. We also have an event, and right now we're not seeing anything show up, and the collision event option is also directly connected to the way we can generate particles with other emitters. We have a scatter, and right now that's not showing up too much, mainly because of our overall options that we have set. But basically this would just kind of scatter our particles around. I'm going to increase our bounce bind power to 200%. And now we can see that a little bit better, how it's scattering and basically just kind of propelling our objects and our particles a little bit faster. And we can really see the difference between a value of 100% and 200%. And one thing to definitely keep in mind is with the bounce bind power, this value does make a very large difference in small amounts. We can set this to 25, and now we can see it has slowed down the effect, and they're just kind of stopping within that collision object. Change that back to 100, and we can take a look, and we can also see attract. And basically, this is going to work very similarly to the target option that we have directly within our emitter, where we can attract it towards an object, except the fact that it will not propel itself directly towards the object. Only when it enters this collision will it be attracted towards the center. And of course we can animate this as well to create a really neat looking effect. And I'll just create a quick animation really quick. Drag to frame 300, kind of move that over, and the inside we can move that a bit, and now we can see as the particles enter, as it's moving, it will all be attracted to the center, and the particles that are not within the collision will of course continue to flow down and not be affected. We'll go to our different keyframes and go ahead and delete those for this collision. And I'm going to move this back so it's basically directly under our emitter. And we can take a look at some of our other options. Let's go ahead and change this back to the bounce mode. And now we can see kind of a cascading effect. And let's first change our bounce bind power up to 150%. And as we scrub through, we can now see that bounce effect where our particles hit and they start to kind of bounce off of our object. So at a value of 100 we don't see that so much, but once we start to move a little bit higher, we're definitely going to see bouncing particles. And we end up with a really neat looking effect that way. Let's go ahead and change that down to 150. And if we move down to the bottom where we can see probability, you can change that down to 50%. And basically this is going to be how likely these particles are to follow this collision object. So if the probability is set to 20%, not all of our particles will be directly affected. And let's change our bounce bind power down to 100. And basically what we'll end up seeing is that some of these particles are going to go through the object, although it can be a little difficult to tell with just a sphere. So let's go ahead and change this to a plane. And now we can see that probability amount showing up, where the reduced effect will have it 20% of our particles kind of going through. We can set that to 100%, and now the effect is pretty much guaranteed that we're going to end up on this object and will be affected by our collision. And with this plane, we can go back and take a look at the bounce mode a little bit higher. And now that we won't be cascading, you can just see all of these objects bouncing up and down. Now there's really no motion outside of that. They just kind of hit and bounce, and they don't really scatter. So we have a couple of other options for that. One is our roughness, and how rough our surface is of our collision object. So let's change our roughness to 25%. Now as we scrub through, we're going to see that our particles will start to scatter outward. And the more we increase that roughness, let's go ahead and bring it up to 100%, we're going to notice them scattering even more. And we can end up with some really cool looking effects that way. Change this back to our sphere. And now we can see that variation where it's just kind of scattering them outward. If we reduce our bounce bind power down to 100 and we just focus on roughness, we're not going to see much of a bounce, but they will scatter a lot more. We change that back to the plane. And now we don't see them bouncing up and down, but they're definitely scattering because of our roughness. Let's go back and change this to a sphere. I'm going to reduce our roughness down to 0, and we have a couple of other options. We have a fixed power and a friction power. We can increase our friction power up to 10, and now we can see how likely they are to sort of fall off the sphere. And basically once they hit it, the higher the friction power, the slower they will be. So if we increase the friction power even higher to 50, then we'll see them barely moving. And it's just the overall friction on the surface. It's pretty straightforward. We could set our fixed power to 50 as well. And now we see that they will basically stop once they hit the object. Set that fixed power to 5, something a little bit lower. And just trying to play around with the idea that these values can set a very high amount. Go ahead and increase our friction power to 20. And also our fixed power a little bit lower. We'll try 0.02. And we see a little bit less of that effect because, of course, the fixed power is a very sensitive amount. And now we can see that a little bit better, where we have only some of our particles sort of sticking and staying in place, and the rest of them are following along our sphere throughout the animation. So let's change some of these values back. Friction to 0, fixed to 0. And now we're kind of back where we were before. We can set this to an inside. And now, once we switch this to inside, our particles will effectively stay within the collision object. And it's a way for us to have an object around an emitter, and then use the inside of it as the collision rather than the outside. And if you think of it as polygons, it's sort of flipping them around. So we can use it both as an inside amount, or check it off, and that way we have the actual object on the outside. And of course, with inside on, it's automatically going to take those particles in the group and bring them into the object. And if I increase our bounce bind power to 200, we can see that they'll bounce around within the object. We can calculate that. and it gives us a fairly interesting looking effect. We'll turn off inside, change our bounce bind power to 100, and of course that bind power also has to do with sticking. So now we have it set to stick to our object, and we're going to need to recalculate this. And then we can change the bind power in this case and recalculate. And now it's going to stick to it a little bit more. And of course, working with the friction, we can also change that overall variable. But collision objects are fairly straightforward. Let's go ahead and create something a little more interesting. Change this to a box. And our bounce bind power will stick with 150. And what I also want to do in this case is change our scale a little. We're going to switch to the stretch option, which we can see under animate, and we select stretch. And I'm just going to change the size of this object a little. Go back to move and pull this up a bit. Also add a little bit of rotation. And now as we go through the animation, we can see it sliding down. Of course, I will want to change this back to bounce. So now we can bounce off of this object and see it flowing down. And what I can do is switch to our move mode, and I'm going to clone this bounce object using Control-C. And that way we don't need to set up another object with the same parameters, and we can easily just clone it and move it over, and now we can see that all of the settings are the same, it's in the same group. And now we can take a look, scrubbing through our animation and seeing it affect both of our collision objects. And it looks like we'll need to move that in a little bit. But now we have these two different planes and these boxes that it is colliding with and flowing down to create a really neat looking animation. And there's a lot we can do with these different collisions. And we can also see that we have the ETC tab for this, which means we can copy and paste settings from one collision object to the other, and also save out these presets and load them in. So if you have a collision object you like working with a lot, where you don't want to have to go and change those settings over and over, you can easily just save those out and then load them in later. And we also have other options available. Record CP we could turn on, and of course with the inside as well. And we can also see by using inside, it is affecting the entire group, and it will basically remove any other collision. We have a no shift option, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later, along with our change, which works directly with new group. And now we can see just by changing and turning that on, once this object has hit that collision, it is now in basically a new group. And since our gravity is only affecting group 1 and our new group is default, we are no longer controlling these particles with that gravity. And we're going to take a look at some more complex options for this and ways we can manipulate other emitters as well in order to create some more interesting animations. But first, let's just take a look at the new group setting by itself with just the one emitter and also one collision object. So what I want to do is just remove our second collision from the scene, and now we can take a look. We can see the gravity is affecting this bounce object and the particles afterwards. And I'm going to set our new group to new group 2. Turn on change. And now we have these particles, once they hit the collision, are now becoming part of group 2. So what we can do is set up other options within another group to control these particles separately. So let's go to our dynamics, and I'm going to add in wind. I'm going to call this wind underscore group 2 and click OK. And I'm going to change our radius to 10 meters, so that way we're affecting the entire scene. Change the group to group 2, and that way we only affect the particles after they hit the collision. And I'm going to change this to explosion. So now we can see that our particles at first are just being affected by gravity, and now once they hit the collision object, they turn into group 2, which is being affected by our explosion. And gives us a really neat looking effect, and there's a lot of things we can do with this. If I change this to rotation Y, now we can see that it's rotating once it hits this collision object. And we can go to the donut and see that showing up. Change this to vortex, and it's only affecting those particles once they hit the collision object, because then they're being changed to group 2. And since this wind is only in group 2, there's a lot we can do with that. So I can also set up a new gravity, call this gravity underscore group 2, click OK, change this to group 2, and now we have gravity set up for our new group. So we can see the gravity showing up and affecting the object along with that vortex wind. Now reduce our power to 25%, so we don't have a lot of gravity, but just enough to pull down our object. And also keep in mind it is going to go through our collision object because our collision object is set to group 1. So once these particles change to group 2, they're no longer being affected by any collision objects within the first group. So there's a lot we can do with that different type of effect between our groups, and we're going to take a look at this a little more in depth, and also setting up some parent and child emitters to create some more complex scenes.